Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. On June 9, 1987, a student demonstration at Yonsei University was suppressed by the police. In the ensuing confrontation, student Lee Han-yeol was shot in the head by a tear gas canister, sending him to the hospital in critical condition. This event, and the general context of the continuation of the military dictatorship despite promises of democratization, triggered a series of more or less violent demonstrations that shook South Korea for the rest of June. Since logically nicknamed the June Democracy Movement, this was the last step leading to the democratization of the country. In this video, the last of this series, we will see how Korean cinema has dealt with the subject. Following his complete takeover in 1980, Chun Doo-hwan continued in the footsteps of his predecessor. He pursued a policy of economic development, favoring the chaebols and suppressing the social tendencies of the population. Political repression against the various opposition groups continued with the systematic use of torture and the establishment of re-education camps. Unlike his predecessor, however, Chun had to deal with a more organized and unified opposition known as the Minjung Movement or People's Movement. This coalition of intellectuals, artists, religious and labor union representatives, journalists, professors, and other students managed to gain momentum throughout the 1980s. To ensure a minimum of popular support, Chun Doo-hwan promoted the policy of the 3 S: sport, screen, and sex. A modernization of the good old bread and games dear to the emperors of ancient Rome. It is in this context that many erotic films were produced in South Korea. This policy found its popular and institutional consecration with the holding of the Olympic Games in Seoul in 1988. Many films have since portrayed the political climate of Korea in the 1980s, dealing with the subject through many different genres, ranging from comedy to murder story. But it is at the heart of The Attorney that Wang Yu-sok directed in 2013. The film takes inspiration of the life of Roh Moon-yoon, who would become president of South Korea in 2003. The essential Song Kang-ho interprets a lawyer specialized in tax law, originally mocked by his profession, but who has managed to become rich and influential. He agrees to step out of his comfort zone to defend a student accused of sedition, a decision that leads him to have to decide between his professional and moral integrity or his new dearly acquired status. The film is based on the Burim case, which took place in 1981, when 19 students and employees were arrested for their involvement in a literary club, which the authorities suspected of subversive intentions. Wang Yu-sok's film is a good illustration of the economic opportunities that the country's development offered to the most resourceful and opportunistic. But he also skillfully highlights the repressive climate that coexisted with these positive developments. The situation that the character of Song Kang-ho faces in The Attorney announced the path he will follow a few years later in A Taxi Driver. It represents the awakening of ordinary Koreans to the cruelty of the military dictatorship and their transformation into political activists determined to facilitate the transformation of the system towards representative democracy.
죄 없고 선량한 국가를 병들게 하는 벌어지고 군사 정권의 하수일 뿐이야. 진실을 얘기하라. 그게 진짜 애국이야.
But in reality, although opposition forces were indeed growing stronger, democratic transition was by no means guaranteed. Chun Doo-hwan intended, on the contrary, to remain in power in one way or another, and he seemed to have enough levers at his disposal to achieve this goal. But in 1987, an unforeseen event thwarted his plan. On January 14, 1987, Park Jong-chul, a language student aged just 21, died during police interrogation. The young activist had refused to communicate the location of one of his comrades. During the torture session to which he was subjected via the infamous technique of waterboarding, his throat was shattered on the edge of the bathtub. The authorities tried to cover up the affair by claiming that he had died of shock during interrogation. Leaks in the press in May undermined this explanation, and the government had to admit that the young student had died under torture. Sensing the danger, Chun acted quickly. The Minister of the Interior and the Director of Police were fired, 2 of the police officers involved were indicted, and a commission of inquiry was set up. But these crisis management measures were not enough to defuse the situation. The announcement of Ro Tae-wo, a general in Chun's faction and implicated in the Gwangju massacre, as the presidential party's candidate in the next election, which was to be held by indirect suffrage via an electoral college designated by the power in place, was the last straw that broke the camel's back. On June 10, 1987, demonstration bringing together more than 400,000 participants shook the country, culminating on June 26 in the mobilization of approximately 1,400,000 Koreans. These events are at the heart of 97 When the Day Comes, which Jang Jun-hwan directed in 2017 for the 30th anniversary of the movement. The film opens with the death of Park Jong-chul and follows a gallery of varied characters who will, all in their own way, contribute to the revelation of the scandal and thus allow the birth of the popular movement against the dictatorship. It is because they decide to stay true to their moral values or professional ethics despite the pressures of power, the risk to their material comfort, and even to their physical integrity, that the events thus described snowball. The film therefore does not show for the most part freedom fighters devoted to an ideology, but ordinary individuals who simply want to do what seems right for them. This is the great strength of the film, which does not indulge in a certainly seductive but most often mistaken romanticism of a providential man, a virtuous hero of democracy who brings down the authoritarian hydra. The film also illustrates well the pernicious effect of repressive regime, pushing members of the system to multiple moral concessions, and thus ensuring their complicity in the process of repression and public control. This moral corruption requires as many people as possible to oppose it. To illustrate these concepts, the film adopts the motif of the relay race. The truth is passed from one character to another, each representing various facets of Korean society. A clever idea to structure and give life to this cinematically difficult concept to visualize. And if liberties are taken from time to time with historical reality, the main storyline remains true to the real cases, and the essence of the fight for democracy is perfectly synthesized by Jang Jun-hwan. 1987 When the Day Comes ends with the death of a student during one of the first demonstrations in June. As stated in the introduction, this scene is based on the case of Lee Han-yeol, a student who during a demonstration on his campus on June 9, 1987, received a tear gas canister on his head and fell into a coma. His agony was immortalized in a famous photo which made him a martyr for the cause and, in addition to the other events already mentioned, galvanized the public in their mobilization against the regime. Lee Han-yeol died of his injuries on July 5, 1987. Today, with the victims of Gwangju and Park Jong-chul, he is considered as a hero in the tragic democratic struggle South Korea experienced. If 1987 When the Day Comes is the reference when it comes to the democratic demonstrations of June 1987, there is another work much less famous which partly deals with the subject. This film is a poem for the beloved one. Produced in 1991, A Poem for the Beloved One is a North Korean film. North Korea had indeed found in the repression of Chun Doo-hwan a perfect opportunity to sublimate its own regime and update its criticism of South Korea beyond the cliché of a puppet state at the boot of the Americans, where the Koreans lived in poverty. The film follows a young activist named Park Young-jun. Aspiring to become a lawyer, he awakens to the hardships of the working class and drops out of school to become an anti-government activist. He takes part in the Gwangju uprising and is sent to prison, where he ends up dying. Park Yeon-jun is actually inspired by Park Jong-chul, the young student whose death contributed to the June 1987 protest. His story here is highly romanticized and melodramatic, linking his journey to other earlier traumatic moments the country had faced. It is fascinating, however, to see how the DPRK propagandists used these real events while integrating other themes more familiar to the very politically oriented film industry of the North. If A Poem for the Beloved One, a title borrowed from the unofficial anthem of the Gwangju uprising, is, with regards to the political events which shook the Republic during the 1980s, artistically and historically inferior to its alter ego of the South, it nevertheless represented an additional degree of sophistication in its description of the country and underlined the extent to which the events happening in South Korea during the 1980s were observed with great attention by its northern neighbor. In the face of street mobilization, Chun Doo-hwan considered at one point repeating the Gwangju precedent to call the military to quell the protesters. On June the 19th, he gave the order to deploy the troops, but changed his mind within an hour and cancelled it. The reasons behind his decision are multiple. The strength of popular mobilization, the weight of Gwangju on the conscience of the ruling elite, and the American opposition all contributed to it. By finally choosing negotiation instead of repression, Chun and his successor Roh Tae-woo gave up part of their powers, preparing the way for the establishment of a true representative democracy. The trade union organizations emerged from it strengthened, the constitution was amended with the political rights of citizens and the power of parliament increased, in addition to the adoption of a presidential election by direct universal suffrage. Kim Dae-jung, the main opponent of the regime, hitherto in forced residence, was also released. While Roh Tae-woo nevertheless won the 1988 presidential election, these concessions enabled a peaceful transition and laid the foundation for a vibrant democracy. According to an indicator put in place by the newspaper The Economist, the country was in 2021 at the 16th place out of 167 in terms of democracy. In Asia, only Taiwan is ranked ahead of South Korea. For nearly 40 years, South Korea experienced various forms of dictatorship. It was only through the struggle of thousands of citizens, many of whom paid it with their lives, that a form of democracy was established. It is worth emphasizing that there is no inevitable destiny or progress there, and that if these efforts ended up bearing fruit in South Korea or even Taiwan, a simple glance at other territories around is enough to see that the will of a majority of the population is not necessarily sufficient to change the system. But that is precisely why the road to democracy that the people of South Korea have taken is so important. Because it shows that the light can be found at the end of the tunnel and thus contribute to the strengthening of the aspirations of the other people all around the globe.